My screen at this point. So welcome to our first vlog series. This is part of the Pride Health UT Pop-Up Research Institute, supported with funding from the Office of the Vice President of Research at UT. And what we're going to be doing over the course of the next few months is having different talks and video series on topics relevant to sexual and gender diverse health and wellness. We'll be recording them and putting them on our libraries page. The UT library has a specific page for our pop-up institute that Yona can put a link to in the chat. And we'll be recording these so that people can see them at a later date, or you can share them. If you have ideas for topics that you want to see, put them in the chat. And we are going to be building up towards a pop-up month in October of this year. And so throughout that month, 3 days a week, we'll have talks from renowned local and national speakers on issues that impact the health of social and gender minorities. And so to kick that off, we're going to start by talking about something that is relevant in the news today. Our talk is called Against Medical Advice, the Impact of the New Federal Health and Human Services Rule on Transgender Health and Wellness. And our speakers today, our panelists, are Elizabeth Sepper, professor at UT Law, Wesley Hartman, who works at the Kind Medico-legal Partnership, Marcy Keefe, who works at Dell Children's Medical Group, and myself. I work at Dell Medical School and community care clinics. So I'm going to briefly read the bios of our panelists so that you can get to know them. If you'd like to put who you are and either your affiliation or area of interest in the chat so that we can better get to know each other, that would be great. So Professor Sepper is a professor at Texas Law and a nationally recognized scholar of religious liberty, health law, and equality. She has written extensively on refusals to provide reproductive and LGBTQ healthcare. Her recent work focuses on anti-discrimination obligations of public accommodations, that is, businesses and social service providers that are open to the public. Her articles appear in top journals, including the Yale Law Journal, Columbia Law Review, and Virginia Law Review. Her article, Doctoring Discrimination in the Same-Sex Marriage Debates, on the issue of religious objections to gay rights, won multiple awards. Sepper received a BA from Boston University and a JD and LLM from New York University School of Law. Prior to entering the academy, she clerked for the Honorable Marjorie Rendell of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, practiced human rights law with a focus on women's rights, and was a Center for Reproductive Rights Fellow at Columbia Law School. Welcome, Professor Sepper. And pronouns are listed at the bottom of the pictures of the panelists. Wesley Hartman is a staff attorney with Kind Medico-legal Partnership, a collaboration between Texas Legal Services Center and Kind Clinic to address the health-harming legal needs of the LGBTQ+ community and persons seeking sexual health services. Hartman's particular focus is working with transgender and non-binary populations. Based in Austin, Kind MLP serves clients statewide through direct legal services, policy advocacy, and training and education. Hartman established the program in 2018 and was a postgraduate fellowship with a postgraduate fellowship after earning their JD from the University of Texas School of Law. Marcy Keefe, our next panelist, has been a nurse practitioner for 20 years and has primarily focused her work on clients experiencing struggles secondary to social inequities. She has provided care to homeless people of all ages in Dallas County with Parkland Hospital, youth and young adults who face homelessness secondary to abuse or rejection by their family, oftentimes due to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, clients seeking PrEP or HIV treatment in a clinic focused on care of LGBTQ+ individuals, and currently provides holistic care of clients in the adolescent clinic. She's been a nurse for 25 years and was a medic in the military before becoming an advanced practice nurse. She has had the good fortune to bear witness and learn from the brave people who share their truth. It is because of them she has the privilege to share their successes, struggles, stories, and continues to advocate for equal rights for all. And my name is Dr. Aliza Norwood. I'm an assistant professor of population health and internal medicine at the Dell Medical School. and I provide primary care, HIV treatment, HIV prevention, and gender-affirming care at community care clinics. I am a native Austinite. I went to medical school at the University of Texas in San Antonio and finished my residency in internal medicine with a focus on primary care at University of California, San Francisco. Afterwards, I worked in the San Francisco Department of Public Health doing HIV vaccine research at Bridge HIV. Had a brief stint in the US territory of Saipan in the Pacific, where I did global health, and I currently practice, again, at Dell Medical School. And I am the leader of the UT Pride Pop-Up Institute. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to start and just jump in with a general discussion about this rule. So I am going to start us off with one question, and I'll interject if we have any lulls, but I'm going to let our panelists start. And again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. So this question, I'm going to start with Professor Sepper and Wesley. I wanted to ask you both, so can you kind of explain to us what this new HHS federal law is for those who are not aware of it or don't fully understand the implications of it? And we also have heard about the recent Supreme Court ruling about discrimination in workplace settings that was considered a really amazing win for the LGBTQ+ community. So how will that law also impact this new federal HHS law?
Yeah, I am happy to kick us off today. I'm sure most, if not all of you, are coming with some background knowledge about the rule. It's been covered really extensively in media, but just to make sure we're all on the same page with some of the same background knowledge. So the administration announced this final rule earlier in June that made several changes to the regulations under the ACA. So it removed gender identity, sex stereotyping, gender expression protections in the regulations, which is what we'll primarily be focusing on in terms of gender expansive folks. But it made a lot of other important changes as well. It removes protections related to pregnancy and language access. It removes protections related to sexual orientation and changes the definition of what is a covered entity under the ACA. So while we'll focus on gender expansive folks, I think it's important to take all of the changes into consideration as a whole and recognize that lots of trans non-binary folks fit into multiple of these populations and will be feeling double the effects of discrimination and access issues. However, when we're talking about the substantive effects of the rules, we're really talking about a hypothetical because it doesn't go into effect until August, and it may never go into effect. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but if people haven't already sued, they will to stop the rule from going into effect. And because of this big win in these employment law cases, I think we have a much stronger argument in terms that we're still protected. So in these Title VII cases, we've held that anti-discrimination laws in the employment sphere that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex also protect LGBT individuals. And so the great thing about that is the ACA also prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And so with this really clear ruling in the employment context, it should be clear that in any other federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, that should protect LGBT people. So that should absolutely be true of the ACA and the healthcare context as well. So again, the substance of the regulatory changes doesn't matter so much because we should still have those protections under the language of the statute itself. I think most of the issues from the rule change come with miscommunication and fear, because gender expansive people struggle to access healthcare for so many other reasons. And one of those in particular is fear of discrimination, right? So when you have a confusing regulatory change under a statute with conflicting case law that makes people think they might not be protected, right, you're only worsening a lot of those disparities.
Wesley, I want to interject there. One, I forgot to mention one of our panelists, so apologize. Samuel Grapiel, and I don't know if you go by Sam or Samuel, he, him pronouns, and you're going to help give us a narrative perspective on these rulings. So I just wanted to introduce you. But what, Wesley, you bring up a really good point that I know as a clinician definitely affects patients. And I wonder if there's a way that this doesn't have to be answered right now, but how we can think about how the clarity of what this rule means and how to maybe dispel some of that fear or make it clear to people what their rights actually are, how we can better disseminate that in the community. Because I think you're right that, you know, people just see a headline and then they may think that if they go to the doctor, they're going to be refused. But so let's try to think about how we as the Pop-Up Institute or other advocacy organizations can help translate the actual reality to people.
I'll chime in. I think that's a wonderful idea. There already are lawsuits that have been filed against the rule. Again, it hasn't gone into effect and may not. GLAD has filed a lawsuit on behalf of a transgender person who was denied care before the rule. And then Lambda has a lawsuit on behalf of a number of providers as well as transgender rights groups. And one of the points of emphasis is the risk of confusion in this kind of back and forth where HHS is making changes to the regulation without really having a legal or medical basis to do so. It's not as though doctors were saying we're having a hard time getting care to transgender people. The problem was one essentially of the administration's own making. So I do agree with Wesley that the ruling under Title VII that if you discriminate against people because of their gender identity or because of their sexual orientation, you have to think about their sex. So you've discriminated on the basis of sex. And I think the major change that HHS meant to have happen of taking away healthcare protections from LGBT people, that's foreclosed by the Supreme Court's decision. So that's good news. But there are a lot of other changes in the rule that are being challenged and may not go into effect, but I want to flag those. And one of the big ones is the scope of coverage. So the previous rule had of particular importance, I think, for LGBT, especially gender identity-based healthcare, had provided that insurance companies that receive federal funding, say Aetna offers plans through the exchanges, Obamacare exchanges, those plans can't discriminate based on sex. But that also meant, according to the previous rule, that every plan that Aetna offers can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So that was pretty wide ranging. Now, the Trump administration, HHS, says that that doesn't apply. Plans on the exchanges might not have to discriminate, but other plans can. Now, again, as a matter of path dependence, insurance companies have gotten used to providing LGBT inclusive care, at least to some level. So maybe they've determined that it's actually not expensive. It's actually probably cost saving for them. So maybe that'll continue even if the regulation does go into effect. So that's something to think about. Also, there's a major religious exemption related to sex that HHS has proposed, allowing any institution or person with a religious objection to sex discrimination requirements to discriminate. Not race, not disability, not national origin. But those are there are other changes as well as to how to enforce, but they kind of get into the weeds. So if there are questions, I can talk about that, but I'll leave that here for now.
I was wondering if I could chime in with a question for Marcy, who is our clinical representative on the panel. So I'm wondering if you've experienced any difficulties with coding insurance now that Professor Sepper has mentioned healthcare coverage as a possible ramification of this. So have you experienced any issues with healthcare coverage for gender affirming care? And do you foresee any issues as an effect of these rulings in regards to healthcare coverage for your patients?
I'm sure Aliza has probably experience with this too, but I think, yes, to answer your question, we have seen this be an issue of coverage regarding certain medications, blockers being one of the more common ones that tend to get denied for younger people who are seeking gender affirming care. Oftentimes insurance plans don't want to pay for, a hormone, and they make it sometimes really tricky. They'll only pay for like a certain NDC code of a hormone, which is like 1 of 100. I don't know. It's just kind of ridiculous. And so they just put some like sneaky little obstacles in the way sometimes to make it somewhat more challenging and more legwork on the behalf of the patient and the staff to actually get what they need. And so we sometimes have to go back, recode things, do a lot of prior authorizations to get medications covered. I feel like it's gotten a little bit easier actually in the past couple of years because more plans seem to be covering the medications, but it does still present itself as a challenge.
Dr. Norwood, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with the confusion on behalf of providers. So full disclosure, I have an interest in gender affirming care, but I was never specifically trained on how to provide gender affirming care. I just kind of taught myself from the available guidelines. But even as somebody who's quite motivated to learn and teach myself, it's really, really hard to figure out how to get these medications for patients. This is so true in many aspects. HIV prevention is the same way, PrEP and that kind of thing. The medical part is very easy. It's guideline based, it's very clear what we're supposed to do, but it is the logistical way of getting the medications to the patient, the payment and the insurance and all of that, which is, I think, intentionally very opaque. And it's really hard to figure out what to do. And so if you go, at least in my experience, if you go to a site that is really well renowned, like WPATH or the UCSF transgender guidelines, they tell you all of the medical information. They do not tell you how do you prescribe this to get around the insurance blockages, or how do you, even the basics of how do you teach your patients who have never injected before how to inject, like all of that kind of critical logistical actual real life stuff you have to find through different individuals' web pages or advocacy organizations that have created their own. So it's this patchwork system of trying to figure out the horrible duct tape way our healthcare system is put together. So yeah, I find it really difficult. And I think one of the things that could be really beneficial is having a centralized place for us to be able to collaboratively figure out how to get around those issues and share information about best practices in coding and knowing the real legal situation. For us clinicians, we sometimes don't know how to interpret the law either. And I don't know if we'll have time to get to the Romeo and Juliet provision, which is separate, but that's something that I've heard come up a lot about, just what are our, how to interpret the law as it relates to our clinical care, and how to figure out how to get around some of these barriers that the insurance companies put up.
I also just want to throw this out there as an example. So we have a nurse in our clinic that she has been at this for, a couple of years, like getting coverage, medications covered through insurance companies and ordering these medications from specialty pharmacies. And she will spend sometimes over an hour on hold on the phone to make this all happen for a patient or a patient's family. And it is so important for these parents to get this medication for their children that's life-saving, and they acknowledge that the nurse spends this much time, and they will literally cry, send cookies and different things. because it's that much work and there's so much back and forth on the phone for the nurse to get those done. So a lot of time.
And looking on the other end of things, Samuel, do you have any feelings regarding these rulings, and what our providers and law experts have said today that may give you a different perspective or illuminate what healthcare is like for people in the queer community? And if you'd like to give yourself a little bit of an introduction as well, we'd be happy to hear from you as well.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sam. I am a non-binary trans-mass individual. My pronouns are he, they, but I answer to either. Either is fine. I have currently been on hormones for about 4.5 years. And I would say I've definitely already dealt with many hurdles trying to, start my transition, whether it's finding, the right therapist that is willing to write me a letter to go see a hormones doctor, or finding a hormones doctor that is willing to work with me, or, my first experience with a hormones doctor before I met Marcy through the Kind Clinic. She was a prominent hormones doctor and still is to this day. And I've been trying to get her out of practice since seeing her myself, because when I first started seeing her, she was charging me about $500 every single time I was going to see her for hormones. That included all of the lab work that I had to do, the appointments itself. My hormones would not be discounted. I could not use insurance. She wouldn't allow me to use insurance for anything. And I didn't know that I had any other options at that point. And so I just listened to her, and I did what I had to do, because, it is life-changing and it is life-saving for me to be on these hormones. And so I just listened, and because I didn't have that access to any other information, I just thought that that was the case. While seeing her, I complained several times about, not feeling good on my hormones. And I found out that she had me at a considerably lower dose than I was supposed to be on. And because of that, it was actually affecting me pretty severely as far as my mental health was going, physical health. I was having a lot of adverse effects because I was on too low of a dose for too long. And anytime that I would try to mention that to her, and I'm not the only person that has mentioned this. I've had several people reach out to me. She would accuse people of alcoholism. She would accuse people of eating disorders. She would accuse people of pretty much any other thing besides her work that was causing these adverse effects from the hormones, or adverse effects from anything, from the care itself. She just would not take responsibility or admit to any kind of fault that she was doing. And so, after that, I had to get off of hormones for about 9 months, which was awful, but mostly because I couldn't afford it. And because also I was scared. I didn't know what she was doing to me. I didn't know how, I didn't know if she knew what she was doing, or if she knew what, if she believed me or anything. It was a really, really trying time. And I struggled, knowing if I would ever be on hormones again, just because I didn't know if there was anybody in Austin or anywhere that I could trust or feel comfortable going to. And I was grateful for, places like the Kind Clinic or Ashwell and Planned Parenthood, who are now making it easier to get access to gender healthcare. But now I'm kind of trying to, we haven't really talked about this, but I'm, as far as the insurance goes, I'm trying to get top surgery at the moment. And that's definitely been a ride. I started applying for stuff in March, and I am still trying to jump through hoops as far as trying to get my insurance to approve everything, because they're like we were talking about with the coding, they need very specific codes, and sometimes even codes that mention the word dysphoria will make my insurance company not cover my insurance. So literally the reason that I want to have insurance, because of gender dysphoria and, not feeling comfortable in my body, those things are actually what will make them not want to give me surgery. So it's trying to find the right ways to get that, to word it and find the right doctors who can write me the letters. On top of that, they not only require you to be on hormones and you have to prove that you're on hormones, but you have to have 3 separate letters depending on which insurance company you use. And so I had to find somebody with a PhD, and then I had to find 2 other doctors in order that would be willing to write me letters. And on top of just trying to get top surgery itself, which is already expensive, I can't even begin to explain how expensive it is to find doctors who are willing to write these letters after and most of them require multiple sessions and are not on sliding scale and charge like a couple of $100s an hour just to write letters. It's ridiculous, and it has been extremely difficult for me to find people that I trust and people that I feel comfortable with and people that I'm willing to talk to. I mean, Marcy can say, since I've known her, I have refused to get any sort of I don't want to say like feminine wellness checks, but you know, like checks like that. I have never had one, mostly because I'm terrified to walk into a women's clinic and, you know, explain, you know, that I am transgender and explain that, you know, I do need these kind of like visits and I do need this kind of healthcare and have them like treat me correctly, like, and treat me appropriately. Like I still refuse to get that kind of stuff done because I am so scared. You know, I haven't had a general physician since I was about 15, and I am about to be 24. So 9 years, I haven't even seen a general physician because it is so hard for me to find a doctor that I do feel comfortable with or will work with me and will make me feel safe and heard and feel valid in my experiences and valid in like what I'm doing with my body. I hope that has kind of answered your questions. If not, please tell me. I'm a little nervous.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'll let Marcy chime in here too, but I just want to reiterate that from a medical perspective, none of that is necessary. So again, from a medical perspective, this is really simple. It's pretty simple stuff. I think it may even be more complicated for adolescents. And I'm not a childhood doctor, so I'm not sure, but in terms of, you know, testosterone for adults and estrogen when needed or androgen blockers, they are so simple and definitely in the purview of primary care doctors. It's not even really necessary to go to an endocrinologist, but I think there is so much misunderstanding and fear and bias and prejudice that it makes it this very complicated situation. But there is absolutely no reason that you had to go through all of that, and I'm so sorry that you did. But I think we as kind of a medical community and as a research community really need to think about ways in which we make it very clear to our communities that this is not acceptable, and make it clear to the community where to go for quality care.
I agree.
Yeah.
Dr. Norwood, oh, I'm sorry, Sam. I just wanted to say, like, I think the overreaching thing is just like not pathologizing anybody who's gender diverse and eliminating that from like training for people when they're in whatever medical aspect they are, dentists, pharmacists, nurses, physicians, and so on and so forth. I think just eliminating that pathology piece of this would be so helpful to avoid more experiences like yours, Sam.
And I think one thing that we can do is draw parallels to things that people understand. Like even with this HHS rule, there was part of the rule that said that they were making this rule because it would be less confusing for providers. And that's literally one of the rationales that I read about the rule. And that I think should really scare us, because if we are codifying things because physicians aren't up to date with their medical knowledge or their understanding of gender identity, that's an education problem. It's not something we should codify into law. We're basically codifying ignorance into law. And so, you know, making people understand that the medical community is updating their understanding. I'll point to intersex surgeries as a great example. You know, it used to be standard of care that when intersex babies were born, they would surgically change their genitalia, and still do, I think to this day, to conform to a male or a female typical genitalia. And we now understand, and there's, you know, the American Urologic Society, which is not like a liberal body, says, you know, that's not appropriate. It needs to be a discussion. There's no pathology with intersex kids and genitalia. So kind of drawing these very like objective medical data points to show that this isn't based on real medicine, these kinds of concerns. So I'm wondering again how we can think about, you know, how this pop-up institute can help to create materials, create research that can be helpful in the advocacy, either advocacy at a legal level, advocacy at a medical level, and then what we can do to help the community understand their rights and get them the right resources they need. So any sort of brainstorming that anybody, either panelists or anybody who's listening to this call, if you guys have any ideas of how we can better do that.
Yeah, I was going to mention too, one of the other sort of justifications for this rule and for basically all sort of conservative rules is a fiscal argument, right? One of the things they propose is that, oh, we'll get rid of these gender identity protections and then trans people will never file complaints and we'll save millions of dollars, which is patently false. And also you're not saving money, you're increasing costs for the healthcare system because you have scared people away from seeking regular, preventative, cheaper care that will keep them healthy and force them into, seeking care only in an emergency when it's expensive and the system is bearing the burden for it. So I think the more research we can produce to counteract these arguments and demonstrate that no, providing gender affirming care and sort of providing it affirmatively in this preventive way, you're going to avoid all of these other emergency and mental health costs. And it's beneficial to the system to just simplify everything rather than spending thousands and thousands of dollars on insurance staff to carefully nitpick and process each one of these claims in hyper detail. You could just approve them for the same amount.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Joel just put something in the comments about how this might affect insurance companies, and I agree. You've got to make a case for the bottom line. Thankfully, I think we can make a case for the bottom line. I think there is data out there, and perhaps we can think about more research studies that could be done on the vast benefits to this care versus all of the negative health outcomes you're going to have by denying care.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, particularly if we do end up with a bad scenario where insurance coverage is restricted, the scope of the rule rather than who gets to benefit from healthcare discrimination. So LGBT people could be protected against discrimination, but it could be that only a handful of insurance plans have to comply with sex non-discrimination obligations. So I think that would be incredibly useful to know. And that would help to the extent there could be path dependence, right? If insurance companies are already covering this. On the other hand, I think so much of what has been discussed here, and Aliza, you pointed to this, is just the massive dysfunction of our healthcare non-system. That's not going to change through anti-discrimination law, right? Almost any medical procedure requires massive amounts of work from medical providers to get insurance companies to cover it. And it's dispersed, it's different for United than it is for Aetna. And so we may be in a moment where we can start thinking about more broadly what reforms would be necessary. Anti-discrimination will not get us to justice and equity in healthcare. And as Wesley noted, right, LGBT people are likely to have lots of other possible traits that lead to their experience of lack of access to healthcare, whether it's disability or race or language barriers and the like.
Is anybody on the call here from kind of an economics background or a public health background who wants to chime in? Because one of the things I'm thinking of, Elizabeth, is the fact that I rarely have these conversations with health economists who I think could be very helpful in making the cases for it. I just don't have the data and the information to make those arguments convincing. And that still is too probably minute and kind of small. What you're talking about is kind of overhauling the healthcare system, which absolutely that's the only way that I think we're really going to get to equity. But in terms of, specific arguments for why insurance companies should cover things, I think having like a health economist participate in this kind of research and work would be really important. So I'll pose one last question to the group, which is, what follow-up conversations would you want to hear? You know, what other panels would be helpful to kind of move this work forward? And what tools and resources do you all think would be helpful either for the community to get better access and understanding, for the medical community, and for the legal community? What can research and what can our Pop-Up Institute do to help on any of those fronts?
Well, I feel like with research, I think part of what needs to happen is involvement from more of the community, from including diversity within the LGBTQ community, to make it feel like a safer space for people to participate in research. Because I think that's one reason there is so little research, is fear of what could happen if they participate in research. So I think that would be a really important thing, is just to involve a very diverse range of people from the LGBTQ community.
So one issue that's near and dear to my heart is the issue of religion and anti-discrimination in healthcare. There are a lot of warning signs on the horizon. Today, for instance, right, the Supreme Court with one hand gave LGBT equality in Bostock under Title VII. Today, with the other hand, it took it back some. So now, I would say, as of today, religious institutions can discriminate against any of their employees on any basis, right? So any LGBT people who work for, say, a Catholic school could be fired. Any Black people who work for the Catholic school could be fired for being Black. I mean, this is not specific to sexual orientation.
I didn't realize that. Could you explain a little bit more about that? Because the headline that I wrote was all related to birth control, and maybe others are more up to date than I am, but I thought it was all related to birth control access. I didn't realize it was broad.
So there were two cases today. The first one was yet another case on the birth control mandate, which luckily was not decided on constitutional grounds. So that's just an administrative procedure case. Did the agency go through the right hoops? It's a very problematic decision, but it can be easily changed if elections lead to different results than we have today. The other case from today involved Catholic elementary school teachers, one of whom had been fired for having breast cancer, the other had been fired for old age. And the Supreme Court said that they and all of the teachers within at least Catholic schools, that is any religious school, but probably well beyond that, are ministers of the church and may not be, and can be fired for any reason and won't be able to sue for discrimination or wrongful discharge. So that limits to some extent the range of the Title VII ruling on LGBT rights. And there's other litigation directly relevant to healthcare. You might recall the conscience rule the Trump administration put out that would allow any provider or entity to refuse care for religious reasons, and any care, and people who are sort of tangential to the direct healthcare experience. So it's not just refusal to provide abortion or refusal to provide hormones, but rather, is the person going to fill your prescription, right? Or bring you food after you've had an abortion. So that rule has been enjoined, so that is not law at the moment, but the Trump administration is appealing the decision of the lower court. So that's something sort of to keep in mind. And there's also another case involving Catholic charities for next term, and whether they're allowed to both receive state money and discriminate against same-sex couples. So the Supreme Court has that for the fall or spring.
And Elizabeth, what role do you see research or advocacy having in either fighting against some of these laws, or who is bringing these laws to the courts? Because I'm just wondering, back to Marcy's point about who we're involving in the work and making sure that it's fully representative. I think you said something to that effect, Marcy, about kind of having a broader coalition. is one of the actions we need to do in this research work or in writing or anything involving people from the faith community who can speak from a position of authority. Because I think sometimes, you know, if we're not part of that community, then we just get written off. But if we can involve more people from the community in that way and saying, this is not a faith, you know, not all Christians, not all, you know, Catholics, you know, are of the same mind on this, and it's more like that core is really discrimination, I think, more than religion, it's interpretation. How do you see that playing out, and how might research help?
I think that's exactly right. I think there needs to be a much stronger narrative about the religious bases for commitments to equality, commitments to gender affirming care, for more messages from providers of faith and LGBTQ people of faith. I think those would be quite powerful and are much needed. I mean, I think as another, we need to know more about how religious institutions are affecting LGBTQ care. There's been a fair amount of research done on reproductive rights and mergers and acquisitions and how that can reduce access to reproductive health care, which is of course something important to LGBTQ people, but there's not a lot done on religious refusals of care to LGBTQ people, maybe because they haven't been religious, right, as you point out, right? They're just discrimination, and maybe they'll become religious, and that's worrisome.
I really like the idea of thinking through both the discriminatory aspects of, you know, I think I've seen studies on religiosity being tied to negative outcomes for LGBTQ folks. But I think there's probably also the flip side of religious institutions that provide community and are affirming, having like really kind of providing resilience. And I wonder if that could be a counterpoint that you could show to people from the faith community to say, you know, we know you care about your people. These are things that, you know, other faith-based organizations have done to help, you know, their community, so that it's not just, I think there's this tie that a lot of people, especially people who tend to lean left, have in their head about religion being all bad. But I wonder if we can change that narrative so that it's not this us versus them, and it's more, you know, how do we push people to use religion for the good?
I would say too, at least here, there's Central Texas Interfaith, which is a nonpartisan, multi-issue organization that engages in policy advocacy for the community. And I think more broadly, what so much of our conversation is illustrating is that there are just too many different factors that go into any person's health, and we can't operate in these silos where, like, I'm going to take care of the legal piece and you will take care of their health, and then someone else will take care of their religion. We have to all be working together and collaborating continuously to create these better outcomes. So I'm really happy, like, I don't know what other organization would have brought together, right, lawyers and academics and doctors and healthcare practitioners together in one place to discuss these issues about LGBT people. So just the fact that we're starting conversations and that they are cross-sector and involving all of the expertise we possibly can, right? The more we can help facilitate those connections and keep them going now and beyond, the better we'll serve our community.
Well, I'd love to see us do another panel maybe during our pop-up month in October, and maybe think about the ways in which we can gather even more people into the fold to have more of these discussions. Elizabeth and Wesley, at UT, at the law school, are there any initiatives you think we could tap into that would be interested in doing this kind of work? And I'm going to think about it from a medical perspective, or alternatively, are there any speakers who are kind of experts in this area that you would want us to reach out to be on another panel discussion in the future? We have funds to pay them.
I'd have to think about the names of speakers. Outlaw is the most obvious group at the law school, and they are very active and engaged. So this might be something that would interest them, especially given everything that's going on this summer.
Yeah, UT also has the William Wayne Justice Center and a really robust pro bono program that, unlike most law schools, really actively engages in providing legal services on at least some limited basis. So I think there are ways to facilitate connections, right, from people in the community needing services to those programs, and may also be opportunities to involve, law students under their faculty supervision, and doing some more of the legal side of the research and planning out some policy advocacy, sort of on the legislative level or on the local level.
I'm wondering if therapists who work specifically with people who experience minority stress from their sexual orientation or their gender identity would be a really useful thing to hear about. And I had another idea, but I forgot what it was. But and I don't know if parents of young children who are gender diverse it would be good to hear from them and just their experiences of how that is for them as parents and family members.
It's a really good idea. I'm almost thinking of this could break out into multiple different panels. And I'm just trying to think about how I don't want everything to be like for a particular agenda, but I'm thinking about how we leverage those conversations to kind of create change. Or I'm also thinking about a potential panel with Wesley talking about how you created a medico-legal partnership in a clinic, because I think more of that would be really useful. And then Samuel, I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about how we could, either through research or through just a centralized website or whatever you think, how we could make accessing care easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if, a lot of people on this panel like work in the medical field, obviously, so I'm assuming that they have a lot of connections, and just like having a list of general care physicians, or like hormone gender care physicians that like exist like in the area that are willing to work with trans patients, just so I could have like one space, or trans people could have like one space to like go and look for this list of like, okay, if I pick somebody on this list, I know that I'm going to be safe. I know that I'm going to be taken care of. Like I know that I won't have to worry about discrimination. I think that would be really helpful. I mean, like I said, like for finding, someone to go get a pap smear, or go get, a test for breast cancer, anything like that, where I wouldn't have to be afraid of, getting discriminated against or getting treated poorly. That would be super helpful. A lot of the stuff, I know somebody mentioned in the chat, a lot of the things that I have found has just like simply been through like Reddit or social media. And those are the only ways that I am able to find resources for myself. I know that the first time that I heard about like hormone therapy in Austin, it was literally meeting a stranger at my job. And if I hadn't met a stranger at my job, I never would have, started hormones. And so just getting that information and having easier access to that information would be great, because, it's just so hard to find anything, except from like word of mouth or from social media these days. So just like having a better source for that would be amazing.
Yeah, I would echo too. I think it's hard for any one organization to pull together the kind of resources it takes to vet that kind of thing. And this ties back into some of the challenges with enforcing legal rights. We have these broad protections that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, but what actually counts as discrimination, right? Does it count as discrimination if the physician refuses to use your chosen name and pronouns? does it count as discrimination if they refuse to ever prescribe hormones or PrEP, even though they absolutely could? You know, we don't really know the limits of this. And so I know we all want to ensure that people have access to resources for gender affirming care, but we can do a lot of planning too, I think, on the front end to figure out how we can guarantee that that is a friendly resource. I think there are so many different layers of issues, right? Somebody might generally be trans friendly, but does that mean you're a non-binary or an intersex friendly provider? I don't know. Or you might be a trans friendly provider, but then, you know, are you accessible to Spanish speakers and available to trans immigrants? I don't know. So I think there's a lot of detail and a lot of ways to put resources towards building up those kinds of lists.
I think y'all make a really great point about accessing lists and accessing knowledgeable providers. So a big part of what we're trying to focus on in the pop-up is not only accessing folks who are willing to provide this care, who are friendly to queer people and minority individuals, but also people who are knowledgeable on how to provide this care. So not only are you welcoming to someone who may be of a different sexual orientation, but knows how to navigate those conversations in a clinical setting and knows how to address sexual health, or is comfortable prescribing hormones, or something of the sort. So I think that provides a lot of fodder for future discussions. And I know that we're about to wrap up, but just another point, thank y'all for participating in the chat box. We had a really great discussion in the chat box about accessing lists in Central Texas and Austin. And there was a little bit of conversation about what was publicly available versus what is privately available. And I think that also notes how providers take precautions in a state like Texas to provide care under systems that may not be explicitly pro-queer or pro-minority. And so, you know, providers, state-funded institutions, and people who are trying to work on minority health within these greater systems really walk tightropes. And so it will be very fascinating to hear these perspectives at some point. Thank y'all so much.
I did just want to, right before we sign off, I wanted to point out that Aurelia, who is one of our steering committee members for the pop-up, put a link in the chat to the Purple Pages, which is in El Paso, but has a list of LGBTQ friendly providers. And her comment was, you know, thinking about just expanding that list to all of Texas. And I also think that having different certifications for specifically what the providers have been trained and are proven competent in would be really helpful. So you could, just like I am certified in internal medicine, but not in pediatrics, I could be certified in gender affirming care for transgender patients. I would have to get a second certification for intersex care. I could also, you know, be certified as a Spanish speaking interpreter. So there could be ways in which patients could kind of choose the provider that's best for them. And I think that's something that if that's something that sounds good, we could think about providing those trainings as part of the pop-up. And then finally, I just wanted to see if anybody had any last thoughts about a question that came through from Dan, which is, how can the pop-up work to identify gaps in existing academic research that would be useful for groups pushing to change local and national health policy? So this might be more relevant to advocacy groups. I don't know if anybody here feels like they can speak on behalf of that, but kind of identifying what are the needs for an advocacy organization to be able to hold up research to help help make their points. Or if we should just reach out to some advocacy organizations to ask them that question.
Yeah, I think reaching out would be a really great idea, because I know that I've spoken with someone who is from one of the local advocacy organizations that has a lot of really great ideas on research and things they want to explore. So, but they're again, not part of this. So I think bringing this all together would be good.
Who are they?
I have to go back to my email and find their name, but I will send it to you.
Okay. And if anybody else knows of advocacy organizations that might be interested in this work who would welcome extra research or point us in a certain direction, let me know. ACLU, that makes sense.
It's Rocky. Do you know Rocky?
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we should have a specific advocacy focused session. Thank you all. That's all I had. Any last comments? Okay, thank you guys. We'll, Yona will put this up on the website for everybody to be able to access later. Thanks again to our
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.